The Universal Declaration of Human Rights states in Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights. Gender inequality in our modern world highlights why human rights are so necessary. However, if we are all born free and equal, why are more than 130 million girls around the world not in school? 64% of illiterate adults, women. Over 12 million girls married every year before the age of 18. 95% of countries led by a male head of state. So, what has been done? The international community began to identify the issue of global gender inequality during the late 1800s. The International Council of Women was founded in 1888. This was thus followed by New Zealand and the colony of South Australia, providing women with the right to suffrage in 1893 and 94. The first International Women's Day succeeded in 1911. The first International Congress of Women was held in The Hague, Netherlands in 1915, promoting women's equality. By 1945, the fight for women's human rights was gaining fast traction. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt was elected as the head of the United Nations Human Rights Commission. The mid-20th century saw the United Nations enacting on the Covenant on Political Rights of Women. Thus followed the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women in 1979, and later, in 1993, the adoption of the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women. The International Conference on Population and Development initiated a global program of action in 1995 as a result of the 1993 Declaration. The turn of the century brought about the United Nations Security Council Resolution number 1820, which recognized that sexual violence can be categorized as a war crime, following with the outlaw of female genital mutilation in 2012. Malala Yousafzai's 2014 Nobel Peace Prize was one of the largest movements towards female gender equality in the developing world. Her recognition as a female human rights activist shone a light on the atrocities faced by girls in order to receive a simple education. In 2015, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals were launched, including a gender equality goal and targets about ending violence against women and ensuring equal participation. To this day, the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women is considered the #1 women's rights treaty. 143 out of 195 countries guaranteed equality between men and women in their constitutions as of 2014. This was a major step for eradicating global gender inequality and can primarily be accredited to the influence of non-governmental organisations. Some major organisations include, but are not limited to, Equality Now and One Girl Foundation. In Australia, legislation restricts discrimination and other forms of vilification, humiliation, and degradation towards women. Both federal and state legislation is somewhat effective in combating the issue. Federal legislation directly targets the issue of gender discrimination in the Sex Discrimination Act 1984. Further federal legislation that targets the issue of inequality is the Workplace Gender Equality Act 2012. Both of these pieces of statute legislation are critical, legally binding documents used to promote one of our most integral human rights. The case of McBain v Victoria 2000 proved that the Australian federal sex discrimination laws are in compliance with our international promises. In this case, Dr. John McBain, a Melbourne gynaecologist, was prohibited under Victorian law from assisting a single woman to conceive using IVF treatment. McBain challenged the Victorian law in the federal court and argued that it was inconsistent with the Sex Discrimination Act. which prohibits discrimination in the provision of goods and services on the ground of sex or marital status. Justice Sundberg of the Federal Court agreed. The decision was unsuccessfully challenged in the High Court by the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference, and the outcome recorded as a critical women's rights precedent. State legislation is not as meticulous as the federal ratification of international law. Acts in force that target gender inequality in the state of New South Wales, such as the Anti-Discrimination Act 1977 and the Defamation Act, display the extent of state laws targeting gender inequality. A 2018 study by SBS News found that gender inequality is still rife within Australia. It is argued that the lack of appropriate legislation may be the root cause of the issue in modern Australian society today. The world has a far way to come to bridge the gap of equality between males and females. It is most pertinent to note the United Nations' significant contribution to combating the issue and its efforts towards paving the way towards a more equal future.